Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, friends from the sanctuary. I can't really think of a more fitting place to launch this book than the sanctuary for independent media here in Troy, particularly because it was here in Troy that 150 years ago, some of the incidents that I'm going to be talking about here tonight happened. Some people have asked me, Scott, did you cover that as a young reporter? Well, almost. It's been a long journey, as was mentioned. I started this many years ago with my wife Tamar, looking into this story, and I'm going to be telling you bits and pieces of it. I'd like to begin by reading you a part of the beginning of the book, and then I'll be telling you more about what's in it. On August 9th, 1932, several elderly African Americans stood at the corner of State and First Streets in downtown Troy in upstate New York, eyeing the side of a stately old brick office building where a bronze plaque proclaimed, "Here was begun, April 27th, 1860, the rescue of Charles Nalle, an escaped slave who had been arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act." Their distinguished host, Garnett Douglas Baltimore, proudly proclaimed the epic struggle to liberate the captured runaway slave that had begun at that spot more than 72 years earlier, calling it the greatest event that has ever happened in this city, and telling how hundreds of people, whites and blacks alike, had packed the streets that day. Among their champions then were Harriet Tubman, the immortal Moses herself, as well as his father, Peter Baltimore, and many others from all walks of life in the community. Brave people of conscience who were pitted against legions of police and hooligans that held the lawful power of the United States behind them. The ensuing battle had gone on for hours and then was repeated in a second fight across the river where a good mob freed him again. Afterward, some respectable citizens of Troy and West Troy had purchased the slave's liberty for $650, finally making legal what had first to be achieved by stealth and force, and finally enabling the man to live at last under the same roof with his wife and children. The actions had set an inspiring example of interracial cooperation, determination, commitment to equal justice that remained unmatched in local memory. And the episode was a significant footnote in the nation's history. Yet, for Charles Nalle and his family, it marked the culmination of a long and harrowing journey toward freedom. Information about a rescue, however, came as quite a surprise to their 77-year-old guest from out of town, John C. Nalle, the son of the former slave in question. Hadn't set foot in Troy since 1865. Earlier that day, for old time's sake, he dropped by for a brief reunion visit while en route to a little vacation in Saratoga Springs, and suddenly found himself treated as a celebrity. Somebody had even assigned a newspaper reporter to cover the occasion. At the time of the rescue, John had been only 4 years old and living far away, so there really was nothing he could add to Baltimore's account, particularly since he was perplexed to admit his father had never told him anything about the matter. 2 months after his visit, John Nalle sent a long letter to the Troy Times thanking them for their coverage of his pilgrimage. He said, "I shall always feel a sense of gratitude toward the citizens of your city for their splendid efforts in bringing about the release of my father from the return to the horrors of slavery. At the same time, opening an opportunity to give his children the elements of an education which was denied to the members of his race under the thraldom of slavery. just why my father never told his family of his experiences in the city of Troy at the time of his arrest, I've never been able to understand. Whether it was due to his innate modesty so that he would not appear as a hero, or his hatred of the damnable institution and those who fostered the institution, I'm unable to state. Be that as it may, he had the satisfaction of giving his children the rudiments of an education, a thing that was denied to him. After living in Troy for 6 years, he moved his family to Washington, D.C. in 1866, where he resided till his death in 1975. Of his family of 8 children, only 2 are now living. This had a tremendous effect on John Nalle, learning about this incident involving his father. So much so that late in his life he set off on an odyssey to try to find out as much as he could about what had happened to his father. However, it was less than 2 years later that, while vacationing at Highland Beach, Maryland, on the Chesapeake Bay, a spot that had become a favorite gathering place for many of the country's most prominent African-American intellectual elite, that on a July night in 1934, he suddenly stiffened and clutched his heart and died. No account of his research was ever posthumously published, and by and large, the incident passed into obscurity. Many of us in this area know very little about this incident. Perhaps we've seen this plaque on the streets of Troy, walking by one day. But that's really all we have learned about it growing up. And I moved into a house that had been on the Underground Railroad back in 1991 out in a neighboring part of Rensselaer County, Sand Lake. And at that time, I began to do some research into what's called the Underground Railroad. And my wife and I went on a vacation to Hawaii, and as I got on the plane and had brought along some reading material, I began by reading a copy of an account that somebody had given me that had been dictated by the famous abolitionist Harriet Tubman. Lo and behold, I began to read about Sand Lake and the Underground Railroad and a fugitive slave named Charles Nalle. And some of these bits and pieces of the story were so fascinating to me that when I hit the ground in Honolulu, I spent most of the next 3 weeks of our vacation in the library in Honolulu studying the Underground Railroad in Sand Lake, where I just come from. And I decided at that time I wanted to write a book about it. I didn't know that it was going to take me 19 years to reach the end. Every book really takes a writer his or her whole life to write. And not always 19 years, but in this case, it's been a long odyssey. Some of the things that I'm going to be noting to you are that this incident that occurred on April 27th, 1860, occurred at a very important time in our nation's history. It was only a few months after the ill-fated raid by John Brown on Harper's Ferry. John Brown, as you know, the abolitionist whom many of us have been schooled to believe was a madman, so mad that he wanted to free the slaves. There were 4 million of them being held in bondage in America at that time. And he and some of his associates, some of them from Troy and other parts of the Northeast, some of them themselves escaped slaves, banded together and decided that they wanted to bring an end to that institution. And as you know, in October of 1859, his raid failed. Brown was wounded and captured. A number of his sons were killed, and other raiders were killed or wounded. A few escaped, and he finally was put on trial.